This is Sovereign Debt, a podcast on greening the global economy and debt sustainability. I'm your host, Jill Doshi. Hello, everyone. So good to be back online with all of you. And I want to first of all thank everyone for their patience. I've been away for several weeks now, and it's been kind of a perfect storm of all sorts of dramas, including me getting COVID, which has been a very humbling experience. And I want to give my sincere thanks to all the scientists and others who gave us the vaccines, and in particular lately, the antiviral medications. Like I said, was a humbling experience. But today we're back online and we have a very special episode with two guests, both of which are very well known to the sovereign debt world. We have Mitu Gulati from the University of Virginia and Mark Weidermaier from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, both sovereign debt experts, as well as the true podcasters of sovereign debt. And if you haven't found it already, you should check out their podcast, Clauses and Controversies. So Mitu and Mark, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Hi, Jill. It's good to talk to you. Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the kind words about our podcast. We have been assigning your podcast to our students. So we were texting each other about how exciting it was to get to be guests on your podcast. So thank you.
No, this is awesome. It's a bit intimidating, I do have to say. I really wanted to start today on asking you about the Ukraine war, and not so much about the actual situation with Ukraine itself, which is obviously tragic and horrible. And I don't want to even really yet get into all of the ins and outs of the Russian bombs and what would be happening. I want to actually focus on another aspect, what this war's potential impact on kind of the rest of the world, kind of outside of the region. It's obviously had a huge impact on the price of energy, and in particular wheat exports, and which is leading to fears of, frankly, just starvation, but certainly food insecurity in many parts of the world, particularly in Africa, hitting many countries at a time where they're already quite weakened post-COVID, and obviously a very uncertain international markets anyway, with rising rates, and they have high debt levels. 60% of low-income countries are already in debt distress or at risk of debt distress. So we already have a very kind of fragile kind of landscape around the world, even before this hit. And it's a time where we need a lot of global coordination to respond. And so my first question, I know it's kind of a vast one, but from your perspective, being observers in this market for so long, do you see us coming out of this stronger? Is this one of these, a crisis makes a good opportunity? Or do you see this as absolute collapse of multilateralism and kind of just a start of a different thing? I mean, does this make it more or less likely for us to actually come together?
I have been, and I've talked about this with Mitu a few times, I have been waiting for the kind of widespread financial calamity since the onset of COVID, and continually surprised that hasn't happened. And it's getting hard to see how we can avoid really, really widespread economic and financial distress now that the war in Ukraine has cut off food supplies, has cut off key markets, has done all kinds of things that are only going to exacerbate the problems in a lot of countries. As for whether this is the death knell of multilateralism or rather a stimulus to increased sort of global cooperation, I mean, the short answer is I don't know, but the long answer is I don't think either, or that would be what I would bet on. we don't have truly multilateral tools for dealing with widespread global debt distress. We never have, and we're not going to get them as a result of the current crisis. Maybe there'll be some incremental steps in that direction. You've seen, the common framework, which I guess we can talk about, which is the tiniest of tiny steps towards greater multilateralism. But we're also seeing things like the U.S. government, through executive branch action, increasingly taking unilateral steps that seriously affect sovereign debt scenarios. So I don't know, we're going to see a bit of both, and probably we're going to muddle through, and then things will look not that different from the way they look today.
You mentioned the common framework, and we have over many years kind of slowly recognized that the Paris Club wasn't, at the center of these sovereign debt issues, because they're not lending in the same amounts as China and others. Sovereigns are borrowing differently, so it's the old architecture, so to speak, wasn't working as well. So we had kind of shifted to this G20 as the new kind of coordinating body or the convening body to talk and to respond to these issues. And I think during the beginning of COVID, there was some hope, right? The DSSI came out, and although it was quite limited, it was at least coordinated action, and that involved China and other non-traditional lenders. But what I'm kind of fearing is, and maybe you're right, we just kind of muddle through with the war in Ukraine and with all the kind of added pressures. Can we come together as a globe? And is there any hope for the common framework? Because so far we haven't had a lot of take up of it. There's not a lot of countries lining up.
I do want to just sort of observe that I think, part of the problem with the common framework is that nobody's using it, as you allude to, or nobody, of course, is an overstatement, but that it has not significantly lowered the barriers to seeking a debt restructuring. And I guess the observation is that a lot of these reforms, including the common framework, treat this as if the problem is on the supply side. Like, countries just don't have the tools that they need to restructure efficiently. And if only they did, they would do the right thing and restructure earlier rather than later, and impose deeper haircuts rather than less deep. And I think the problem is not a supply side problem, it's a demand side problem. Countries don't want to restructure. Their political leadership doesn't want to restructure. Their Rajapaksas they knew that all along, but they're really realizing it now in Sri Lanka. So I don't know how one addresses that problem, but the common framework doesn't really get at it in any kind of direct way.
When you're sitting there in the Ministry of Finance and you're looking at the countries going through the common framework, even if you did want to do kind of a preemptive restructuring with your creditors, the examples that you see out there are kind of a little bit daunting. You're like, well, maybe not, right? Maybe I will wait and take my chances.
I think Mark has gotten it exactly right, although maybe I'll try to give my more cynical spin, although it's hard to imagine how one could be more cynical about the common framework, given that, we all know it just didn't work to do pretty much anything. But the basic point that for a long time, we've been worried in the sovereign debt research world, at least. I think this is not the case, and Jill, you can correct me, in the world of practice, but in the research world, paper after paper after paper just goes on and on about how governments are primarily motivated to try and reduce their debt at every opportunity they can, and rush towards every opportunity or mechanism that will enable quick and enormous debt restructuring. And you look at the data on how governments behave, and it's the opposite. The governments don't want to quickly restructure or preemptively or opportunistically. And yes, there are some cases where, pushed to a corner, governments do stupid things that the market hates, but seems like we've gotten the incentives upside down. And to the extent we're still designing institutions that are based on these outsized fears of moral hazard and a particular type of moral hazard, we're just going to get it wrong. And this is just one more time we wasted that opportunity, at least. You've seen restructurings from the inside advising the governments. And I mean, my limited experience is no Ministry of Finance is rushing towards restructuring. They whenever I've had the opportunity, and it's not that often, of saying, look, you've got these provisions in your contracts, or you have this opportunity to reduce your debt, let's do it preemptively. They give you this look of utter horror, like you're somebody who just doesn't understand how the world works. It's like, no, we'd never do that. We want to pay.
No, exactly. I mean, it's absolutely true. And I can say that all ministers of finance, I think, went to honor those contracts, and no one wants to be sitting in the seat when those hard decisions have to be made. To actually call creditors and say, sorry, we're not paying you anymore. We have to sit down. And it's true. They do want to avoid that at all costs, to their detriment often, as you say. The literature definitely says if you reach out to your creditors earlier and sit down and kind of preemptively handle it before the crisis gets too intense, it's better for them, even politically. But it's just not the way it plays out often.
You asked about Ukraine, and I can't help but think about this there. And maybe the two of you have a different perspective on this, but to me, the idea that Ukraine, in its current situation, where it desperately needs every penny to help its population, is paying its debts in full and on time and promising people that they will pay all of this, is just upside down. Because I think if ever there were a situation where creditors would understand this is not Ukraine's fault, and they should be given time and at least a little break until the war is over to regroup, because otherwise we're going to be in a situation where they're going to have to do a brutal restructuring at some point. The West is not, I think, going to give it all of the money to pay back the debts. I don't know if you and Mark have a different view, but I don't see, even now, a lot of the money that's going to Ukraine, some of it is grants, but a lot of it is in loans that, if the history of the loaning countries is anything to go by, they're going to want their money back.
No, I agree. And it definitely does kind of defy some logic that they say that we're going to keep paying. But it goes to that spirit of we're strong, and it's almost a question of honor for many countries, of just saying, no, we are going to pay these debts on time, and we don't want to be the one to default, even in these extreme situations. Is there anything to do for the common framework, or do we just kind of wait for it just to kind of keep getting muddled in market situations? There should be a better way, right? We can't let them. I suppose we could continue to try to find organized ways of saying you can preemptively default or talk to your creditors and lessen that pain so that it can still be the honorable choice, let's say.
Yeah, and I don't think, as a technical problem, creating mechanisms that allow for relatively efficient consensual restructurings and that provide for rough intercreditor parity, even across different types of creditor classes. Even the loans from Chinese state institutions, loans from private bondholders. In principle, the technical problem of creating tools that allow for those debts to be restructured on reasonably equal terms, it's just not very challenging and not a very difficult problem to address. One can do it, I think, by contract. The issue again is that there just isn't that much appetite for it. Nobody is particularly interested in slowing throwing sand in the gears of a transaction when the loan is just about to be made. No one wants to haggle over new contract terms. Government officials, they're playing one lender off against another as best they can. They're not haggling for the best terms that they can possibly get. Again, it's hard to think of what will fundamentally change that dynamic, but I don't see some great moment when we talk about multilateral solutions. We really mean all of the creditor countries of the world sort of coming together and agreeing to abide by some common set of rules. I think we're quite a ways from that. But
in addition to all of the other kind of global challenges, there's definitely one huge one out there that none of us can ignore, whether we're Ukrainian, Russian, Chinese, American, anybody. If you're living on Earth, you have to think about it, and that is climate change. And we certainly know that there is a massive financing gap, certainly for the kind of middle and low income countries, when we think of all of their global commitments under the Paris Agreement and the various UN conventions. They're just not able to invest in particularly the adaptation for the lower income countries that is kind of going to protect the poorer people that are disproportionately affected by climate change. So we do, in that sense, need some sort of, again, it can be market-based, but we need some innovation around the system to be able to get the money from more developed countries, one way or another, into kind of developing countries for all of the needs that they have. And I really wanted to kind of talk to you about this, particularly because last year, the two of you on your podcast had an episode which was called, if I have it written down here, "Why Are ESG Sovereign Bonds Such Scams?" So that was just kind of begging for me to kind of bring you on to talk about that. Because as you know, this is an issue that myself and Potomac Group in general has been very passionate about. So I wanted to kind of bring you on and see if from last year you had some change of heart, or what is your current thinking? I know that there is lots of reasons to be concerned about greenwashing and the like, but I just wanted to kind of exchange views on this and see if I can turn you two into some sort of eco warriors. So
I think I'm still calling green bonds just eyewash, but I'm not sure. So I've listened to enough optimistic people, and I do care desperately about the environment for selfish reasons. I'm from Kerala in India, and the global warming has really changed our weather patterns to, a large part of my mom's home fell off a cliff. So this sort of is very real to me now. Maybe it was some other factor like too much building and urban development, but certainly the climate has changed. That said, it worries me a lot that many people in our world are so optimistic that the world of green bonds, because issuers such as many countries are promising to engage in green projects, that will be the solution. Maybe it is, but unless there is adequate monitoring and enforcement of the actual promises, I find it hard to believe that they're actually doing this. If these are the same countries you don't trust to pay back their debts, why do you trust them to fulfill their green promises? So that's my reason for pessimism. If somebody actually measures the green promises and says, hey, look, countries, while they may not actually pay you back their debts, can be trusted to fulfill green promises. I'm all on board. Now, the positive aspect, and I think Mark and I disagree a little bit on it. He may not be as pessimistic as I am on the green bonds, although I think he's kind of pessimistic. But I am very optimistic about the Belize transaction because, and you've talked about that on your podcast a number of times, and I think there, because of the monitoring and enforcing via the Nature Conservancy, that might actually work. And also there's a lot of public buy-in, as I understand it, in Belize on the ground. So if the government tries to, renege on the deal, that there is public pressure that can make this work. But that's, to my mind, the Belize deal is very different from a green bond. It's sort of the other end of the universe. So that I believe, I think that was really positive for the world. I hope it's really positive. Green bonds, I think, are utter shit.
I won't echo what Mitu said about green bonds, although I mostly, almost entirely agree with it. I guess I find these conversations a little bit hard because I don't always know what the exact question is. And I feel like optimists and pessimists in this space sometimes are optimistic or pessimistic because they're judging the transactions by a somewhat different standard. So I think Mitu's absolutely right that one of the great and innovative and hopefully replicable things about the Belize transaction is that it solved the fundamental credibility problem that plagues so much lending in this context, where nobody who lends money should have any assurance the government is actually going to do what it says it's going to do. I think people are confident, and for good reason, that Belize is going to carry through on its promises to engage in protecting the marine environment. What I think people sometimes imply in the really optimistic takes that I sometimes hear is that investors will pay a lot more if only the government gives them some kind of credible promise that it will do green stuff. And that to the extent the evidence shows, and it does show, that the so-called greenium basically does not exist or is so tiny that it needn't be talked about, that the explanation is fundamentally about credibility, and that if only you can solve the credibility problem, you can get a real sustainable, replicable pricing benefit if you promise to do green stuff. I would like for that to be true, and I am very skeptical that it is true.
I agree. Sadly, with sadness, I agree. I don't think there is necessarily a substantial greenium to be had. However, I do think if the transaction is structured properly, and we'll come back to this, I think if it's structured properly, you can bring in a different type of investor in emerging markets. Let's say if you have a structured deal, a sustainable product in an emerging market, I think you can structure it in such a way that you're bringing in a different type of investor who might have different threshold for being there.
And are those people? It does make sense, but I guess one corollary of what you're saying is that this investor that we're trying to bring in, I take it they're not participating in the sort of vanilla market for ESG bonds, because if they are, then as I read the evidence, bringing them in doesn't matter because they're either not there in sufficient numbers or through some other dynamic. The pricing benefit that you get is zilch, and so you might as well issue a non-green bond. I mean, you get maybe a trivial pricing benefit, but not enough to close the financing gap that you're talking about.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I think there's so many nuances in all of this conversation. So I think to break it down, I agree with you that the greenium, all evidence shows that it's not out there. Although they did talk about one in the Belize deal, but even there, I would question how big it really was. But I think where I'm headed, where I'm trying to steer us to, is the sustainability linked bonds, because I agree that there is a problem with just what we call the use of proceeds bonds, these green bonds or blue bonds that don't have any teeth to them. And I think that's what both of you have kind of really honed in on in different ways, of just saying that there's no kind of legal ramification for non-compliance. It's kind of centering around some sort of credibility issue. But I think what you like about the Belize deal and what we're trying to replicate and hopefully scale and kind of really kind of focus on is the real tying of the implementation of the conservation, the real kind of outcome, into the actual bond documentation, that it's not just left up to credibility and you're kind of just hoping, because then you won't get a greenium for that. But if you have something more structured in like the sustainability linked bond, which is very clear of what are the indicators and what are the triggers within the bond, then you have, and very clear monitoring, reporting, verification, there's a whole kind of system around it, then I think you can bring in, hopefully, a different pool of investors who might go to places that they wouldn't normally go. In other words, for an emerging market issuer, you are expanding their pool of investors. You're reaching, hopefully, those kind of ESG investors who don't normally go to those markets.
Let me wade into this with the somewhat pessimistic view, and then you guys can hopefully tell me why I should be more optimistic. So I see the sustainability linked bonds, as I understand what people are talking about. So the folks at the World Bank, at least, I've heard at a couple of conferences now, very enthusiastic about it. They're willing to say, the usual green bond stuff that doesn't work, but here we got this magic tool for you. We're going to set sort of targets, and if you do better than the target, you'll get a little benefit. The amount you pay goes down. You do worse than the target, you'll have a little penalty. The step ups and step downs. Here are my worries about this. And again, Mark and I spend a lot of our time reading the contract documentation, and that perhaps biases us in a certain way. But as Mark had brought up before with the common framework, these again seem very much supply side driven, and in particular, official sector, clever economist mousetraps, to use a term that our dear friend Anna Gelpern often likes to use. Very clever in theory, and then, but sort of basic elements as to whether or not the market really wants them, whether or not you can design these contracts in a way in which you can get accurate information that the government doesn't manipulate. So let's think about the GDP warrants that Argentina used, that were heavily the baby of the IMF, that saw, 3 Nobel laureates in economics say that this will save the world. So we're going to push it on these countries that are restructuring, because nobody in the market really wants these. And they purported, I think, to say we'll get a whole new class of investors who really like a sovereign debt that's really an equity instrument. And they couldn't write the contracts properly. It just ended up this is just like horrible litigation that's going on with the GDP warrants, and no market was created. So, if I look at the handful of bonds that I think come closest to sustainability bonds, so the Chilean issuance recently that got lots of publicity, or the Ukrainian, there's a government guaranteed bond. And my students and I, we spend a lot of time looking at the legal language. And it really boils down to the country can do pretty much whatever it wants on the contracts, because they decide who's going to verify. They decide who's going to give the numbers. This just seems like a recipe for disaster. But Mark, you have a more positive view, maybe?
No. I mean, it just seems like a rating agency problem on steroids. So looking beyond even you're right, Jill, that Mitu and I have started by focusing on the kind of pure green bonds, the use of proceeds bonds. But even looking beyond that, the problems of articulating clear and identifiable targets and verifying the success in hitting those targets and getting people to agree on what, in my view, ought to be sort of punitive step-ups if you don't hit the target. I don't really see those problems as likely to be solved by, at least not by the proposals I see that are out there now, or by the folks who are most, many of the folks anyway, who are most enthusiastic about the sustainability-linked bonds. I think they like the concept, but in practice, I have a hard time seeing this leading to any real change. I don't want to take us off this topic a bit, but I just wanted to throw out an idea. Jill and Mitu, you may have a reaction to it also, that the Belize transaction has sparked in me, which is that in some ways the problem that's being solved is a political problem on the borrower side. Investors may or may not give a damn about ESG goals and may or may not be willing to pay for it. But we know that politicians are not particularly good at prioritizing them. And they have short time horizons. They tend to favor more immediate domestic concerns than investments in climate adaptation and mitigation. And so one way, maybe this is also cynical, but one way I kind of think of the Belize transaction is that the Nature Conservancy comes along and persuades a bunch of politicians to tie their hands with regard to the use of some proceeds. And maybe that is the real innovation, is convincing governments to actually mean what they say when they make these kinds of green promises. And if that has any resonance as part of the problem, that's another thing that these sustainability-linked bonds are frankly not likely to change, not unless they're designed in ways that people really aren't thinking about right now.
I agree in this with the sense of that's one of the outcomes of the lessons learned from the Belize deal, is that going back to this idea of don't waste a good crisis or something, is that there was an opportunity for the Nature Conservancy to step into the debt restructuring conversations and offer a solution or help, support to the Belize government for it to have a solution, and in the process create these binding commitments on all of government going forward for many, many years. I think the question is, when we're trying to replicate that or scale that to other countries, because the real trick is the Nature Conservancy can't be everywhere. And there are not that many countries where they've been present for 30, 40 years like they were in Belize. So the real trick that we've been trying to work on is okay, so how do you roll this out to more countries? What are the lessons learned that we can take? Are there other structures or templates that we can create so that this is kind of more accessible for other countries and other actors, not just the Nature Conservancy, but anyone else who wants to play that role of supporting the country in the implementation of the conservation.
I'm curious as to what you think, Jill, about this. It is sort of, we have Sri Lanka in front of us. There is so much that could be done on the conservation front there. They're right at the equator. They're vulnerable to tsunamis. They have beautiful coral reefs like Belize.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a very large debt stock. So one of the cynical perspectives that Mark and I get, because we've been very positive on the Belize deal, I think, at least for us, we were very positive. and people are like, well, it's just one bond. It was just a manufactured transaction. It's all about the Nature Conservancy. So the rubber will meet the road in Sri Lanka. And here we have a relatively large debt stock, and we don't have, I don't think, the Nature Conservancy having such a big footprint there. I'm wondering if you don't mind us asking you the question, I'm wondering what your thought is about whether a Belize type transaction could be designed there. And I heard Lazard and Clifford Chance, if I recall, are working on that restructuring. So, Clifford Chance worked on the Ecuador social bonds. I think they would try to do this, but you're the one with the real experience on the ground. What do you think?
I think in the case of Sri Lanka, what you do have, which is similar to the case of Belize, is that despite all of the political turmoil and issues going on in Sri Lanka, from what I've understood, there is consensus across the political spectrum that their future development depends on sustainability, and there is a common acknowledgement of their vulnerability towards climate change and its effects. So I think there will be interesting solutions for Sri Lanka that will look to, as they're restoring debt sustainability, to look for restoring or bolstering other efforts in a broader sense of sustainability, whether that's their green economy or their blue economy, which is so important to them. And as you were mentioning, Mitu, it's very personal for a lot of people. And this, I think, as you go from one country to another, and certainly the countries that we're speaking to across, Africa and Asia, they feel this. So it transcends politics in some ways. And certainly we know here in the US, obviously climate change response can be extremely political and people can disagree, and maybe I'm naive, but I do think that is something that can unite if there are solutions and if there is global support and financial support coming with it. I think there are solutions that can be made. But I think the key then is always coming back to this issue of credibility and actual impact. So there has to be real action. So I think the worry everywhere is just about greenwashing and kind of pretending that you're playing lip service to this just to get through an immediate problem. But then once the immediate problem's gone, that there is no action. And I think what makes the Belize deal so compelling is that there is this whole program of implementation, the Marine Spatial Plan, and there is all of civil society, and it's really kind of the whole transaction acts as a way of organizing all of that effort. So I think when we look to other countries, those are the lessons that we can take, is one that it is an all of government effort, that there can be political buy-in from different parties and different parts of government to do it, but then you have to have also kind of real implementation and real monitoring of those programs.
I think this is something that we all, I think, probably do agree on, and this is a somewhat optimistic take. I want to just circle back to say that, since, as I understand it, we all more or less think there is not a substantial greenium associated with this, then the issue we're talking about here is not really an issue of finance. It's an issue of domestic political economy, and these transactions are tools for organizing a domestic political economy that will carry through on commitments to engage in climate adaptation and mitigation. And that's terrific. That's sort of an amazing thing. It won't solve the financing gap.
But I think then we can, because it is a global issue, you can kind of supercharge it if we do bring in credit enhancements or guarantees, because the other fabulous thing of the Belize transaction, and should not be overlooked, is the role of DFC. So we've been focusing on the role of TNC and the kind of implementation of the conservation, but the real other magic wand of the Belize transaction was DFC's support. So I think when we look to other cases and how do we replicate this or how do we scale this, we need more DFCs out there in the world, or we need their engagement, and we need credit enhancement that kind of greases the wheels of this whole machinery that allows all of that domestic political economy to kind of come together, civil society to come together, and all of the conservation acts to really happen in an accountable way. I think if you bring in kind of like I said, the DFCs of the world or multilaterals or whoever it might be, but you have some sort of credit enhancement, then you really are kind of off to the races, I think.
I think that's possibly true. I mean, I think there are questions about how much the kind of intrinsic value of the political risk insurance that DFC gives, really is worth. But this is a way of saying, I think that we need lots of official money, and I think that's something that I also agree with. Just as the problem of decarbonization is mostly a rich country problem and not a problem of finance, it's just a problem of politics. I think in part the funding for climate adaptation and mitigation in poor and developing countries is probably also going to have to come through increased and creative use of official funds.
I totally agree. And that's why I was kind of being tricky and asking you first off about global coordination. Is there any hope for that? I mean, how do we push that?
I don't know about the how do we push, but I think that we have to go a little bit beyond even official support. One, I think the DFC type thing, it has shown us that it can work, but we could perhaps do it even better by having the official sector willing to say, look, we're going to give you the money, but you don't need to pay us back. You need to put this money into supporting the kinds of projects that we saw in Belize. So, the climate problem is a global problem, and it's largely overwhelmingly been caused by the rich countries. And now we want the developing world and the emerging market world to really do the work of helping solve it. And I think one way is to pay for them doing it. And crass though it sounds, maybe the debt restructuring context is one context through which money can be given on the condition that it is used to solve part of the climate problem. It's not, I mean, not just guarantees and not just DFCs type stuff. I think that the funding has to come with the kinds of strings that the local population will support and will help enable the monitoring. Now, maybe that's just way too optimistic.
No, but I think what you're saying is that that there could be an element of whether it's the DFC sort of stuff, but it could be also guarantees. It could also be some of the grant funding that we're doing. But if we can channel that through in a way that is also used in order to mobilize kind of more private sector finance from investors who I agree may or may not care, but they're, whether or not there's a greenium there or not. But if you had some official sector money in the mix, then yeah, okay, we might go there. We'll take a look at it, right? And you could mobilize more, using that official money, whether it's grants, guarantees, insurance, whatever kind of credit enhancement product you can use, but then there's like serious strings attached to how it's used and consequences, and that all then gets into your world of actually how to write all of that down in a bond document. But the using the targets and the triggers and then you have the TNCs of the world who can actually help with the implementation.
Yeah, I mean, we know that the fund is really good at getting countries to do what it wants them to do. I mean, they have a long history of doing that, often getting countries to do things that may not have been good for those countries, but they're really good at that. So let's try to use those mechanisms to get the good stuff done for once.
So have I convinced you?
I think we're all on the same page. We're so desperate to get it work. I mean, it's crazy that the world is going in this direction where we all know is going to be really bad for us and for future generations. But even if we don't care about future generations, for us, but getting coordination, sitting in the US where you still hear people saying, oh, there's no climate change, it's all bullshit. It's just, these are just the cycles of weather patterns. You're like, oh no, we're doomed. But I don't know. I mean, November will show us whether or not a lot of any of this actually has any plausibility.
I mean, there was in the Financial Times an article of how the US Treasury was upset with the World Bank on slow action of climate change. So maybe there's a window to try to push, for more action.
We can be hopeful. That's about what I will say. I mean, yeah, that's from your mouth to God's ear.
Okay.
You have two pessimists here. This is what we do. We're very pessimistic about human nature and about governments and whether there'll be real change, but we desperately want it.
No, I hear you. I hear you. And I know. And that's why I wanted you on, because literally when I listened to that one, and it was before I was on yours, and I was listening to some and I was like, oh no. And I understand about green bonds. And I think we all kind of share the same opinion, but I did want to try to hash it out a little bit more with you of that there may be ways. One has to get very creative, and it might be, a little bit more structured than, say, the normal bond markets really want. But this is a challenging issue. So we have to. It is going to require a little bit of complication in its response.
And there is, and this is got to be the last thing. We've taken up too much of your time, but there is a difference if we go back in history and look at all of the sort of do-good endeavors in the market. So, I mean, you have the sort of pro-diversity endeavor, you have the anti-apartheid endeavor, you have the anti-dictators endeavors that periodically show up, you have the anti-sin stocks endeavors, and most of them are just truly marginal and nobody really pays any attention to them. The ESG thing, in particular, the E part of the ESG thing with the green bond market, is different in one major way, at least to my knowledge. We've never seen such a big expansion in the do-good part of the market. I mean, for whatever reason, this is just growing at an exponential rate. And it is the right thing to do, to figure out how do we figure out how to use this in a beneficial way? We don't want it to be just bullshit. If there is this enthusiasm, we want it to be channeled to good uses. And so that, I mean, it astonishes me that there is so much enthusiasm. I just don't, I want to force it to be genuine.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we know that participants in financial markets are quite willing to attribute positive effects to their behavior, and to the extent can claim to be acting in service of the environment. Everybody wants to think that finance has a really positive role to play in this, and I think there are certainly signs that some optimism is warranted and that some good things can come from some innovations in the sovereign bond markets. So I wish we saw similar kinds of innovations in the politics of the rich countries, who really are the ones who matter here, not just because, as Mitu says, they caused the problem, but because they really are going to have to provide substantial amounts of capital to fix it.
Well, I was going to ask you for your last comments, but and it was going to be saying, what would you say to either debt managers or even more importantly for this conversation, policymakers? But maybe that's it. Just open your checkbooks.
That works for me.
Yes, I agree. They need to open their checkbooks. Enough of this wishy-washy stuff, or we'll give you a little tiny insurance, or maybe a baby guarantee, or worst, we'll give you technical support to issue another green bond. Please, enough of that. Like, give us real money to solve the climate problem.
That's a very succinct message that I'm happy to end the episode on. So, thank you, Mitu and Mark, for being here today and for all of your time. And let's keep the debate going, because I think we are all kind of a healthy mix of both pessimists and optimists.
Well, thank you, Jill. It was really a treat to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah, same here. Thank you. A wonderful opportunity for us.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.